This is the head of a marble statue of a Greek god. We actually don't know which god, because this figure has been defaced. Like, literally defaced. Someone, almost certainly a Christian during the late Roman period, took a chisel, an axe, or a saw and completely obliterated the statue's face, and in its place carved a deeply incised cross. This is not an isolated case. Museums across the Mediterranean display evidence of ancient Christian violence against Greco-Roman divine statues. Sometimes they gouged out the eyes, other times they chiseled away the mouth or noses, and in many cases marked them with the cross. All of these are clear examples of religious intolerance, conflict, and violence in the late Roman world. As Christianity gained political and social dominance in the Roman Empire, violence and suppression of traditional Greco-Roman and Egyptian religious practices often played out in the physical destruction of sacred images and places. It's tempting to see these acts as simple reactionary violence, an attempt to erase an offensive object from existence, destroyed out of anger, hatred, disgust, or blind fundamentalism. And while those feelings and motivations probably played a role, iconoclasm, or the mutilation of divine images, is rarely just about destruction for destruction's sake. These actions have deeper political, religious, and symbolic meaning. Notice that many of these statues are not completely obliterated. Instead, they're mutilated in specific, deliberate ways. What's the logic of chopping off a nose, gouging out the eyes, carving a cross into a forehead? And what can we learn from these about religious violence and intolerance in the late Roman Empire? Let's start with how ancient Greeks and Romans viewed divine statues. For many modern observers, it's easy to see these statues as just art, as in aesthetic objects, crafted by human hands. And sure, valued for their artistry, technique, and historical significance, but ultimately just inert matter. In museums, they're treated as cultural artifacts, displayed behind glass or on pedestals to be admired rather than worshipped. Now, there are a lot of reasons why someone might see a divine statue as just art that we don't have time to get into, like the rise of scientific materialism or the influence of Protestant thought. Protestantism in particular has historically viewed religious images with suspicion, by emphasizing faith as an internal experience that doesn't require mediation through physical images. This was not the case in antiquity, though we should not assume that all Greeks and Romans shared the same opinion about divine statues. The Greeks and Romans regarded statues of the gods in complex and fluid ways. Sometimes they treated statues as if they were the gods themselves, or some sort of reflection of the god, while other times they regarded them as inert material objects. For example, the Greek philosopher Porphyry was somewhat scornful of the idea that gods inhabit their statues, writing that it is light-minded as to think that the gods dwell within the statues. Other philosophers, such as Dio Chrysostom, saw statues as a necessary but imperfect way of representing the divine. Since true divinity can't be directly seen or depicted, humans rely on familiar imagery, particularly the human form, to make the gods more comprehensible. But he argued no statue could fully capture a god's essence. So Greek and Roman views on divine statues varied, but generally speaking, they were focal points for communal rituals and could act as a medium for divine presence and communication at specific moments. Worshippers regularly cared for divine statues, washing, dressing, and perfuming them. Statues played key roles in rituals, from sacred marriages to banquets, where gods were honored as guests. In the city of Magnesia in western Turkey, for example, images of the 12 Olympian gods were dressed in their finest garments and then placed in a formal dining room symbolizing a divine feast. Statues of gods were also central to public ceremonies. In some festivals, priests and officials carried divine images through the city streets. A painting from Pompeii depicts one such procession, showing the goddess Magna Mater carried on a wooden litter, which would have been a common sight across the Roman Empire. Ancient sources describe people physically and emotionally engaging with statues, touching and embracing them, or leaving offerings in front of them. In the city of Sagalassos, worshippers placed small bronze feet as offerings at the base of statues of the god Asclepios. Asclepios was the god of healing, so these offerings might have represented body parts that he had cured. Votive body parts, or sculpted limbs and organs, have been found throughout the ancient Mediterranean, offered to gods like Asclepios as expressions of gratitude for miraculous healing. Some statues were even believed to act and react, moving, sweating, or responding to people. The Greek treatise titled On the Syrian Goddess describes the rituals conducted at a temple in Syria, saying that the statues sweat and move and utter oracles, and that they cry out when the temple is closed. A poem attributed to the poet Theocritus tells of a statue of Eros that suddenly fell and crushed a young man for being cruel. Was this the statue's will or the gods? Regardless, stories like this show how people saw divine statues as more than mere representations, but as loci where divine presence or power could suddenly manifest. So although there was a range of opinions about divine statues in antiquity, overall they were not merely admired as art. They were washed, kissed, clothed, carried in processions, hidden during times of crisis, and yes, stolen, destroyed, or defaced in war or religious conflict in acts of sacrilege. Which brings us back to Christian violence against statues. Why destroy them? Well, the obvious answer is idolatry. Worshipping other gods and the graven images of gods is kind of the top sin of the Bible. And early Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian railed against idolatry as the defining corruption of Greek and Roman religion. But early Christians were not strictly opposed to visual representation. From paintings in churches and monasteries to the elaborate frescoes in the Roman catacombs, early Christians didn't have an issue with images in general. What they opposed was idolic images, images linked with cultic practice and divine embodiment. By cultic practice, I mean the Latin word cultus, which refers to the care of a god, the rituals, offerings, and ceremonies performed to honor a deity. And as we've seen, cult statues served as the focal points of these practices, and so Christian writers aimed much of their attacks against them. This distinction may help explain why three-dimensional statues rather than two-dimensional images were the primary targets of Christian destruction. Ancient Egyptian relief sculptures notwithstanding, because Christians attacked those too. This also helps explain why pagan imagery continued to flourish well into the Christian period in textile and paintings. For example, textiles like this one from Egypt date to the 500s, when the Christianization of Egypt was already well underway, but yet it depicts the god Dionysius, holding a wine bowl and dagger and flanked by a satyr. This suggests that images of the Greek and Roman gods were still being produced in Christian Egypt, and might indicate that they were not seen as particularly threatening or incompatible with Christian life. This image is not receiving cultic attention, perhaps making it less threatening to Christian sensibilities. But a standing statue in a temple or public square, something that people would adorn with clothing, garlands, or offerings, that was a different matter. That's not just a piece of art, it's an object of power. And while biblical condemnations against idolatry provided a theological explanation for these attacks, they don't fully explain the logic of destroying them. There were several other motivations at work here, one of which being a concern about demons. A key motivation behind these attacks appears to have been the belief that demons literally inhabited these statues, or that statues could somehow invite demonic influence or possession. The Christian apologist Athenagoras goes deep into the subject, writing, if the pagan gods do not exist, why is it then that some of their statues display miraculous power? He goes on to answer his own question, saying that Christians don't deny the power of these statues, but we believe that they are caused not by the gods, but by the demons, who usurp the name of a given image. In other words, demons are inside these statues. He later clarifies his position further, arguing that while people believe certain statues can predict the future or heal the sick, that's not actually true. Neither the statues themselves nor the gods they represent have any real power. Instead, he argues it's demons pretending to be these figures, tricking people into thinking that the statues are miraculous. We see this belief throughout ancient Christian texts, including a dramatic example from the hagiography called The Life of Porphyry, when a group of Christians carrying a cross walk by a statue of Aphrodite on the street. The text says the demon inside the statue could not handle the sight of the cross, panicked, and then flew out of the statue, shattering it into pieces. And because these objects were believed to be the haven of demons, you could be vulnerable to demonic attack or influence if you're not careful around them. The theologian Gregory of Nyssa says that looking at a stone statue can make you motionless like stone. The Bishop of Carthage, Quodwalt Deus, also mentions a girl who was suddenly possessed by a demon after seeing a nude statue of Aphrodite in a bathhouse and attempting to imitate the statue's pose. The text says, and by imitating, offered herself as a home to the devil. Ironically, this belief is not categorically different from the traditional Greco-Roman view that statues could move, speak, or manifest divine power. Both perspectives assume that these images were more than just lifeless objects. But the key difference here is that Christians saw these forces as demonic rather than divine. But we shouldn't overgeneralize here. Just as traditional worshippers had diverse views on divine statues, not all Christians bought into the idea that statues were vessels for demons. Many early Christian writers dismissed them as nothing nothing more than lifeless hunks of rock or metal, man-made objects that had no special divine or demonic presence and definitely were not worthy of worship. The theologian Clement of Alexandria called it truly nonsense to adore senseless things made by human hands. The Christian text called the Epistle to Diognetus takes aim at the materiality of the statues, asking what makes a stone statue any different from the stone we walk on. The Bishop Athanasius took a logical approach. If statues manifest a god's presence, then the artist who made the statue should be even more worthy of worship. He compared it to writing. If letters and words impress us, then the writer is even more impressive. So while some Christians saw pagan statues as dangerous and demonic, others dismissed them as nothing more than meaningless objects, emphasizing that their power came not from gods or demons, but from the human imagination. However, much of the archaeological evidence of Christian violence against statues points to intentional efforts to neutralize perceived demonic forces. For example, let's look at the crosses that we see everywhere carved onto mutilated statues. Sometimes we see them incised on the forehead, like this head of Aphrodite, or this bust of the Roman general Germanicus. Others have crosses elsewhere on their head, like this head of a goddess from the Sparta Archaeological Museum, with crosses over her eyes and mouth. In Christian thought and practice, the cross was an effective apotropaic symbol. Apotropaic meaning having the ability to ward away danger, misfortune, or malevolent forces. Christian amulets often featured crosses, door lintels were marked with them to block demonic entry, and some Christian leaders even encouraged making the sign of the cross for protection. For example, in one of his more anti-Semitic sermons, the Bishop of Antioch, John Chrysostom, argues that Christians can defend themselves against supposed demonic power residing in Jewish synagogues by making the sign of the cross on one's forehead, declaring if you fail to sign your forehead, you have immediately thrown away your weapon at the doors. This cross on the forehead practice, both on statues and in everyday magical rituals, seems to echo early Christian baptisms, when the sign of the cross was used to exorcise and seal the individual before and after baptism. The 3rd century text called the Apostolic Tradition instructs the bishop to lay his hand on the individual, and he will exorcise every foreign spirit. When he has finished exorcising them, he shall breathe on their faces and seal their foreheads, ears, and noses. A similar ritual logic could be at play here with these statues, essentially baptizing it, expelling the demon from the statue, and marking the forehead as a seal, blocking the demon from returning. We also see this belief in the way Christians often selectively damage statues, mutilating just the eyes, nose, mouth, hands, feet, or genitals. Now, don't get me wrong, Christians definitely obliterated statues too. Archaeologists have found statues smashed into hundreds of pieces, but the selective mutilation points to something like ritually neutralizing the statue through precise and deliberate defacement. In his groundbreaking book on the subject, Making and Breaking the Gods, the historian Troels Murup Christensen argues that these selective attacks suggest that early Christians saw the statues as what he calls embodied objects, treating them almost like living beings with functional body parts. Gouging out the eyes may have been seen as blinding the statue, preventing it from seeing. Chiseling away the nose could symbolize cutting off its ability to breathe. Destroying the mouth as a way to silence it, stopping it from speaking or influencing people. In Roman Egypt, Christians often targeted the feet of Egyptian gods, which historians think may stem from an ancient Egyptian belief that mutilating the feet prevented movement in the afterlife. Chopping off the genitals could represent ritual castration, or stripping the statue of its power. Take, for example, a statue of Aphrodite in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, where the breasts and genitals were deliberately defaced. While this might reflect Christian views on modesty, scholars like Dr. Christensen argue that it should be understood in light of that aforementioned story when a girl was possessed after looking at a statue of Aphrodite in a bathhouse. This kind of targeted destruction suggests a deeper fear that nudity could invite demonic influence or temptation, making a person vulnerable to possession. So overall, Dr. Christensen argues that these selective patterns of destruction suggest that to their Christian attackers, these statues were not just passive objects. They had a kind of presence that needed to be neutralized. And as far as the attackers were concerned, to quote Dr. Christensen, these images could be harmed and killed in similar ways to human bodies. Now, not all Christian attacks on statues were about demons. Destroying divine images was a political act, tied to shifting power in the late Roman world. Statues were not just religious objects. They symbolized civic identity, imperial authority, and public life. As Christianity reshaped the empire, statues became battlegrounds over who controlled public space and cultural memory. Take, for example, this inscription from the city center of Ephesus. Having destroyed a deceitful image of demonic Artemis, Demeas set up this sign of truth, honoring both God, the driver away of idols, and the cross, that victory-bringing immortal symbol of Christ. Artemis had been the patron goddess of Ephesus for centuries. Her famous temple, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was a major religious landmark. But sometime in the 400 CE, a Christian named Demeas destroyed an image of her and proudly left this inscription to mark his victory. The text even suggests that a cross once stood on this pedestal, possibly replacing the very statue he tore down. This was a provocative display of religious dominance. Greco-Roman religions didn't just vanish overnight when Constantine converted in the early 300s. Even 100 years later, when Demeas set up this monument in the 400s, Ephesus still had a significant non-Christian population, with traditional gods still being worshipped. Divine statues remained in both public and private spaces. We have evidence of active temples well into the 500 CE, such as at Baalbek in modern Lebanon. Christian sources even mention so-called idolatry in the city of Edessa into the 700 CE. So Demeas' act was a power play. By physically replacing the revered image of Artemis with a Christian symbol, he was asserting Christian control over public space. And even if this inscription dates to the later 400s, when the pagan audience in Ephesus may have been smaller, it still functioned as an effort to reshape civic space in explicitly Christian terms, marking the cityscape as a place where Christianity had triumphed over a now defunct divine patron. So destroying divine statues also had social and political motives. They were displays of Christian triumphalism, reinforcing the dominance of the new religion. Christian texts often frame these events as victories, celebrating the destruction of statues as proof of Christianity's superiority. In many accounts, converts themselves were depicted as tearing down their former gods, emphasizing the total transformation of their religious identity. Although many of these stories were probably exaggerated or even fabricated entirely, they helped unite Christian communities by giving them a shared history of conquest. And sometimes this violence was sanctioned by the state through legislation. Although Constantine is often remembered as a great idol smasher, this is largely a later Christian exaggeration. Well, he did close some Greco-Roman temples, but he took a more pragmatic approach to traditional religions. In fact, there's no archaeological evidence of widespread statue destruction during his reign. Widespread destruction of divine statues didn't ramp up until Theodosius I and his successors, who issued a series of anti-pagan laws that were later compiled in the Theodosian Code, under his great-grandson Theodosius II in 438 CE. These laws sought to suppress non-Christian religious practices, banning sacrifices, temple rituals like divination, and ordering the closure or repurposing of temples. Those who continued practicing traditional rites faced penalties. One edict issued in 407 CE under the reign of Emperor Arcadius specifically decrees that images of gods should be destroyed. If any images stand even now in the temples and shrines, and if they have received or do now receive the worship of the pagans anywhere, they shall be torn from their foundations. Notice again that concern with cult statues, images that were actively used in worship. Now, it's hard to gauge how strictly these laws were enforced or how widely they were obeyed. As Dr. Christensen argues, law codes like the Theodosian Code often reflect imperial propaganda rather than everyday reality. And plenty of people simply were indifferent. They didn't see any problem offering incense to Apollo on one day and going to the Christian saint shrine the next day. But the reign of these emperors does coincide with sporadic outbreaks of violence that often included the destruction of divine statues. The Greek philosopher Libanius describes gangs of monks roving through the countryside, attacking temples and destroying statues. He calls them a black-robed tribe who attack the temples with sticks and stones and bars of iron. Then utter desolation follows, with the stripping of roofs, demolition of walls, the tearing down of statues, and the overthrow of altars. And the priests must either keep quiet or die. Christian sources confirm that episodes of religious violence erupted periodically. One of the most famous examples occurred in the city of Alexandria in 391 CE, with the destruction of the temple of the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. Tensions had been building for years until they boiled over under the Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, who, with imperial backing, led an attack against the temple, ultimately destroying it. Christian sources describe the event in grim detail, particularly the dismemberment of the colossal statue of Serapis. Writing 11 years after the attack, the church historian Rufinus describes Christians wrenching off the statue's head, chopping off the arms and legs with an axe, and then scattering the pieces all over the place, before burning the torso in the city's amphitheater for all to see.
A papyrus dating to the 500s depicts Bishop Theophilus standing triumphantly over the ruins of the Temple of Serapis, highlighting the role that bishops played in Christian violence against Greco-Roman divine images. In the late Roman world, bishops were becoming powerful religious and political figures in their own right.
And bishops like Theophilus derived part of their authority from their perceived ability to identify demonic threats in the environment and to lead their communities in purging them, whether by exorcism, public preaching, or in extreme cases like the Temple of Serapis, outright destruction. Again, it's hard to say how common these attacks were. While the destruction of the Temple of Serapis is pretty well attested, most of these stories come from hagiographies, biographies of religious figures meant to inspire devotion and not provide objective history. These texts function as propaganda, often exaggerating or even inventing stories to reinforce Christian authority and to frame religious violence as divinely sanctioned. While they reveal how later Christians wanted to portray themselves as warriors of the faith, these stories don't necessarily reflect what actually was happening on the ground.
Violent episodes like statue mutilation are indeed some of the most visible and dramatic examples of religious conflict in late antiquity, but they don't tell the whole story of Christianization. Christianization is one of the biggest topics to try to wrap your head around when you study the late Roman world. It's seemingly simple to understand. Christianization is the process through which the Roman Empire became Christian. But this is deceptively simple because it assumes a clear linear shift from one religion to another, when in reality the process was fragmented, uneven, and often ambiguous. What does it actually mean for society to become Christian? Do we measure it by the number of churches built, the number of people attending liturgy, or the rise of Christian names? Does the presence of bishops and monasteries indicate a fully Christianized society, or just the expansion of church institutions? Is it a Christianized society when one side is destroying Greco-Roman statues, but many of these people are still wearing textiles with Greco-Roman gods on them? As the scholar of early Christianity David Frankfurter argues, Christianization was not just about the formal structures of the church or imperial policies. It played out in the daily lives of ordinary people, through shrine visits, ritual practices, and even the ways people navigated illness, protection, and divine intervention.
Remember those votive body parts left by the statues of Asclepios? Well, worshippers of Asclepios used to go to his temples and sleep there, hoping and waiting for the god to heal them, a ritual that scholars now call incubation. And Christians continued this practice, but now incubating at shrines for the saints instead of temples of Asclepios.
Rather than a sudden or uniform conversion, Christianization was a gradual and localized process where Christian symbols, idioms, and techniques were layered over older traditions, sometimes replacing them, sometimes destroying them, but often reinterpreting and incorporating them into a new religious landscape. This complexity also helps us understand why Christian violence against statues was just one part of a much larger transformation. While some statues were violently defaced, others were quietly ignored, and many were repurposed into new contexts. The fate of these images reflects the broader, messier reality of Christianization. Not a simple purge of the old world, but an ongoing negotiation between preservation, adaptation, and rejection. Some scholars describe this as an ebb and flow between syncretism and antisyncretism. Now, syncretism is often described as the blending of religious traditions, but a better way to understand it is as a process where local communities actively shape and reinterpret new religious symbols and practices on their own terms. In his research on Christianization, Dr. David Frankfurter argues that syncretism is a creative and dynamic process, an ongoing negotiation often driven by indigenous religious leaders integrating new ideas into traditional beliefs and practices. Local shrines might survive by being rededicated to a saint or angel rather than being destroyed as a haven for demons. Antisyncretism, on the other hand, describes efforts to reject or purge certain religious practices that are seen as impure or incompatible with a supposedly authentic and pure system. It's when religious reformers selectively identify certain traditions as unacceptable, labeling them as heathen, idolatrous, or demonic. But anti-syncretists are not always consistent. For example, the Christian monk John of Damascus defended the Christian use of icons, while at the same time attacking pagans for using divine images, saying pagan abuses do not make our veneration of images loathsome. Blame the pagans who made images into gods. Just because the pagans use them in a foul way, that is no reason to object to our pious practice. So even anti-syncretism is a selective process, choosing which traditions to incorporate, modify, ignore, or destroy to shape Christianity on their own terms.
Christian violence against statues was one example of anti-syncretism, but as Dr. Christensen argues, Christian responses to Greco-Roman religious imagery were not limited to destruction. They also included indifference, reuse, and reinterpretation. Some statues were smashed, others were defaced but left standing, and many more were simply ignored or repurposed into new contexts.
Christian attacks against Greco-Roman divine statues are an example of anti-syncretism, but as Dr. Frankfurter highlights, anti-syncretism was not a unified or consistent movement. It was an uneven, often contradictory process driven by local leaders with differing priorities. Some, like Bishop Theophilus in Alexandria, condemned and destroyed traditional religious institutions outright, while others encouraged adaptation and assimilation. Overall, Christianization was never a straightforward replacement of one religion with another. It was a messy, contested process, shaped both by rejection and accommodation, destruction and transformation, as communities navigated the shifting religious landscape. We're witnessing a changing religious landscape today, too. In the US and Europe, traditional religious affiliation is declining, but the trend lines are not simple or one-directional, like a simplistic story of atheism replacing religion. Instead, we see a more complex transformation, where institutional decline is paired with the rise of individualized spirituality or sudden reversals of trends. For example, a recent study found that Gen Z in the UK is actually less likely to identify as atheist than previous generations, with many embracing a more personalized, eclectic spirituality. Stories like this are fascinating, but how they're framed depends entirely on who's reporting them. That's why I use Ground News, today's sponsor. Ground News is a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. They aggregate stories from a bunch of different media outlets and pair those stories with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting. So let's take a look at that Oxford University study, which I first came across on Ground News. It found that 82% of Gen Z in the United Kingdom identify as spiritual, while only 13% consider themselves atheist. Ground News aggregated coverage from over 20 sources, with centrist outlets making up the largest share and a slight tilt toward right-leaning coverage compared to left-leaning sources. We can learn even more using the headline comparison tool, which reveals how different media outlets frame the same story. In this case, right-leaning sources emphasize a revival of belief in God, with headlines like "Young Brits more likely to believe in God than older generations." Meanwhile, left-leaning sources focus on the decline of atheism, running headlines like "Gen Z far less likely to be atheists than parents and grandparents." It's a subtle shift in language. One frames the trend as a resurgence of faith, while the other presents it as a decline in non-belief. With Ground News, you can spot these differences at a glance and see how narratives are being shaped across the political spectrum. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being underreported or completely overlooked by news outlets with specific political leanings. This helps break us out of our news bubbles and see which important stories are receiving disproportionate coverage on the left or right. If you'd like to give Ground News a try, Ground News is giving Religion for Breakfast viewers 40% off their Vantage subscription. Go to ground.news/Religion for Breakfast or click the link in the comments below to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.